topic is a particularly interesting one. For one, we really deep dive into what really are the fundraising options for India Aid. Mr. Shroff, welcome to the show. I'm also joined by Mr. Sunil Shroff, also joining him is Pranav Sharma and Yash Ashar, who are the partners at the firm. Mr. Shaw, in my last conversation with you, I remember that, and we spoke about that there perhaps appears to be a foggy kind of sentiment in India. I think that kind of extrapolates very well to sort of what we are talking about here in terms of the fundraising matrix and how do you maneuver that. And this question sort of really becomes pertinently very important when you have the loosely bandied terms like the new normal, the next normal, because that normal is perhaps not really known. When do we return normalcy? And the conversations in the boardrooms really is about being anti-fragile. And that essentially means that how do you grow through change and challenge. And when you have to grow through like that, you need funding and you need strong funding. Corporate India seems to be in a double whammy right now, already reeling under the slowdown. You also have this huge disruption brought about by the COVID scenario. It means that your funding options are constrained. I want to understand from you, Mr. Shaw, that as Corporate India Inc., how does it maneuver through these kind of scenarios? Give us some color and the broad structure there.
Thanks, Srija, and glad to be sort of back again on the network. Hopefully, the others will join as well. So, delighted to sort of continue this webinar series from the last time. And I think this conversation, of course, is happening in the context of the pandemic crisis. So let me first begin with a few general observations. Since this is clearly an unprecedented crisis that the world has not seen, no corporate has seen as well, and it's a double crisis. It's not only the health crisis of COVID-19, but also the lockdown itself, which has created many consequences. So while it's all closely related, the two separate points here. It's the virus as well as the lockdown and all the stuff that goes along with it. So many corporates and businesses have faced what I call a sudden death, where in many cases the income has reduced to zero almost overnight. Then let's talk of the policymakers. I think the policymakers all over the world have fired almost all their bullets. Maybe they have got one or two spare, but they've mostly emptied the canister in terms of firing the bullets, but nonetheless, neither are the disease numbers really coming down, and nor has the sort of positive economic impact that they envisage been that visible as well. So it's the kind of running out of options. Depending on the sector, I think the impact varies. Some sectors are facing an existential crisis, others are facing the crisis of slow growth and challenging growth and maybe no long-term future, whereas a few others, which are probably more in the new economy, are actually seeing this as an unprecedented opportunity for growth and for reinvention, which otherwise would have taken. So I think that there was a comment made by somebody, I forget who, that 2030 has happened in 2020. So it's
already here.
Yeah, 2030 is already here. There are also strong imperatives to do deals, but whether they could be M&A deals or divestment deals. But every corporate has to do some transaction in order to stay relevant and to survive through this. Markets are volatile, but they're also liquid. I think it could be some of the global stimulus money that is rushing around in the system. So you have these scenarios every week where the stock market price has every day you hear about a record high or a record low, and you don't know which part of the roller coaster you are on. As far as the lending community is concerned, they are in an extremely risk-averse mode. Whilst they are largely liquid, I think that their appetite for taking on risk, which was already fairly broken pre-March, is broken even further. And whilst there are policy nudges to them to sort of lend, to provide finance just now to companies who need it, at the same time, I think the question which any prudent banker will ask is, am I going to get this money back? Because at the end of the day, that's what they are concerned with. And I think the risk aversion is extremely high. To that has been added uncertainty by a couple of kind of policy and legal development, one of which is the suspension of the IPC, which has its own rationale, and I have no intellectual quarrel with the fact that that was something which was required. But the fact is that with the suspension of the IBC, I think that the toolkit of the lenders is diminished at least for a short period. Further, as far as judicial interpretations are concerned, we've seen in the last what's called the COVID quarter, in many cases where enforcement of security has been hampered, and a normal outcome of say enforcement of a pledge or other security have been kind of effectively deferred because of the overall kind of empathetic concerns with what's going on. I feel that sort of projects in terms of project lending to large capital commitments would definitely be slow, and how debt would look at it itself is also very uncertain. Consumer credit and retail credit may be a bit better because at least the default rates may be more manageable. Not would be higher than before for sure, but more manageable compared to corporate credit. So there is a strong motivation on both borrower as well as in the system side to do transactions. There is liquidity that is available, so there is significant both policy and commercial friction to these things happening. So we have today two outstanding practitioners. We have Yash Asher, who leads our capital markets practice and is a veteran of many transactions. So he will shed some light on the equity piece. And Pranav Sharma, who is a prolific banking lawyer and does all sorts of structured instruments, and who's very adept in that space, will give you the debt perspective as well. So with that, I think let me sort of turn it back to you, Srija, and to both Yash and Pranav to begin. But I don't. So Srija, if you're still on, do you want to sort of bring in Yash now?
I'm there. Yash, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yash?
I can hear you.
Yeah. This strong for us in terms of the pockets of both opportunity and challenges across sectors. While there's some sectors, the boards are really low. For some sectors, like the tech or the new sectors, it's really been called uneven recession, so to speak. For the tech or the gaming or new platform, it's been really called that this is the new digitization drive. And as you mentioned, the future is already here. I want to understand from you that, as companies about raising capital, equity forms a very important part. Perhaps that also becomes one preferred source of capital. Is that so? And perhaps throw some light on what really regulators, the government, is doing to support more equity issuances, especially in these unprecedented times. Yash?
Thanks, Srija. I couldn't hear you clearly, but I'm not sure the problem on my side. But to the extent I could hear you, I'll try and answer this question. And firstly, thank you to Mint for hosting us for this seminar, and it's my pleasure to be here this morning. Thanks to all those who are spending time on a Saturday morning to listen to us. In terms of where we are seeing the growth, and let's just spend a little bit of time on what's happened in the last 3 months. The first 15 days or 20 days, which is the end of the last financial year and the beginning of this financial year, all the companies, whatever company they were, whether tech or otherwise, I think all of them were trying to figure out what exactly has happened. Many had to go into survival mode. Many which were unlisted had to look at sources of funding. So there was really not much happening in that 1 month. 1 month was pretty much like a holiday for me. However, come 15th April, clearly there was obviously this was the way in which we were forced to live our lives, and to that extent, companies had to adapt. And tech companies, particularly those which were in delivery of, say, food or other sort of daily use equipment, cosmetics, etc., those type of companies obviously have started to do very well. Most of these companies, however, are unlisted. So I think I'll come to that at the later part of our discussion, Srija, and spend some time on that. But in terms of what we started seeing is effort clarification from the regulators on that. Secondly, whilst you could do a postal ballot and do a shareholder meeting, the important question and the simple question was, how would you deliver the notice to shareholders? Many a time, people say correspondence with the companies where they are shareholders. So that was sorted out. I think that was a big change in towards the third week of April when the ministry resolved that issue and permitted companies for purposes of raising capital for unavoidable circumstances to send newspaper advertisements and communications by email and any other mode, and they made it very flexible. And while people may think it's for this period, one of the things which is going to change is this. The ways of communication are now going to change. So that I think was very interesting. Immediately, we had companies rushing to the board meetings and particularly financial services companies. And I put the companies which have approached us and who started their exercise are mainly in two buckets. One who were very strong and who would have still done very well through this period, but despite that wanted to raise capital and be strong. The others whose business model was strong, but who could have had cash flow concerns. There was no money coming in, remember. So the businesses had stopped. So those were the others. Of course, there's other categories. The category where neither the business was strong, nor did they see the future to be very bright. Those are not able to raise capital even today. But in terms of the first two categories which I mentioned, those were clearly starting to look at ways and avenues to raise capital. And I'm happy to say that in the last 2 weeks, our firm already advised on two QIPs, both of which started towards the end of April. Very challenging transactions, both in the financial services space and both for companies which were fairly strong and which were very confident that they would ride this through very comfortably, but they felt the need to have what they call confidence capital, ability to shore up their capital as well as have a war chest which could be used opportunistically once this tides over or even during this period. So those are the kind of companies which are raising capital, and that was done, as I said, through QIP method, which is to selective shareholders. We've also seen other financial services companies and other sort of mixed manufacturing some other companies who have a retail exposure start work on their rights offerings. And that also is fascinating because, and we can spend some time on this, Shrija, is in 2008-9, when the last crisis sort of hit us, and I'm not talking about the period from 2010 to 14, which was a slow period for cap market, but from 2008-9, we had this huge number of QIPs, but we didn't have as many rights offerings as we are seeing now. And we can discuss the differences and why that's happening. But we are seeing a lot of activity on the QIP side, on the rights side, and these sectors, financial services, and a mix of everything else. I can't. Ideally, hospitality, retail, everyone will need money, but I think a lot of them are trying to still find their feet and then probably focus on this.
Okay. I think Yash, thank you for sort of laying this out for us. So are you suggesting that, India is becoming more and more comfortable to sort of do deals in a more synthetic environment? Sort of, are we seeing that, and is that sort of a new revelation or learning happening more from the QIP side or the capitalists that you mentioned right now?
Absolutely. As in, I have never done a transaction in my life where I have not met the client even once. So I think this was a big change. This is a big change where all discussions were on obviously virtual sessions. And being a capital markets lawyer, the difference, and I think people may not really appreciate, but capital market lawyers almost from the time I started my practice to now almost live in the offices of their client. Of course, over time with virtual sort of data rooms and virtual presences, it's reduced, but not become zero as it is now. So I think getting people comfortable, and then there is a lot of confidential data, board minutes, other RBI inspection reports. Historically, companies were reluctant to share that electronically. But now I think given the new normal, that's been a big issue. The other issue, which, very simple issue, signatures, right? How do board members sign prospectuses? How do auditors sign comfort? Mm-hmm. How do you sign an agreement? So whilst many people may wonder, but people don't have scanners room. People don't have printers room. So I think that how we evolve solutions for all of that, we worked with our financing team and worked out how we could get contracts which are enforceable and do combination of things, do an email, attach some paper, so take a photograph. So I think we had to come up with unique solutions to make sure that all of this was later on not questioned, because remember, there is no judgment on this, there's no guidance on this. So that is a challenge which we have to, because there are only one or two ways in which a digital signature is actually recognized. You signing on a piece of paper, taking a photograph and imprinting it somewhere is not a valid contract. But how you do it, how you can make that stronger. Simple things like that. So I think which were very fascinating, that every day you would have a new problem. Then there are no weekends. When you work like this, every day is a working day. So, because every day is a Sunday. So from that perspective, that was a new challenge.
Every day is a Monday.
Every day.
That's a great correction coming from Mr. Shroff. Every day is a Monday, not a Sunday.
So
Yes, your boss just corrected you. You're in the Sunday mood. He said you're in the Monday mood.
he knows I don't work Saturdays, so it's just for him I'm doing this webinar. So I'm just clarifying. So from that perspective, it's been a fascinating 2 months. I think thanks to the companies, thanks to the regulators, to being flexible, to allowing us to do things. Thanks to all the shareholders, because we've had India's largest rights offering in this last month. I think that's just amazing, right? To pull off a rights offering with the largest number of shareholders in the country with wide
So
participation.
I wanted to come back to actually you sort of bring it sort of very importantly here, that while there are regulations and interesting sort of observations being done on how to conduct deals in this new normal environment, as you mentioned, but why are the rights issues being preferred, as a mode of capital of fundraising? Give us some color there.
Absolutely.
And perhaps you can share your own experience in doing some of those large transactions.
Absolutely. So there is to my mind, a purer reason, and there's also a real reason, and I'll go through both. Globally, a rights offering is the best way and the fairest way to raise capital. So for example, Singapore Airlines did a massive rights offering. There have been others who've done massive rights offerings around the world. Why? Because it's anti-dilutive. If you hold 1% of the company, if you participate to the extent that you have a right, your 1% will remain 1%. I think that is why people around the world prefer a rights issuance by a company, so that their shareholding does not reduce and they have an opportunity to participate. Also, it is at the present price. So at the present price, you may not want to go into the market and buy, but if the company needs money, you as a shareholder are willing to, subject to your convenience and availability of funds, you are willing to fund the company. So that I think is one way of looking at it. Very pure, clean, altruistic way that rights offering is right there. And the other thing, what is happening is, and I think we need to appreciate, is that many promoters are willing to fund their company. They could do a pref allotment, which is much quicker, much faster, does not need an offer document, does not need any diligence, no bankers, etc. It's no lawyers. So it's very simple and quick to do. But what happens? The pref allotment pricing is the higher of 2 weeks or 6 months. So if you take a 6-month average of any stock price in India, that's going to be much higher than the 2-week price. So that's not in favor of the promoter. The other more important reason is to do a pref allotment, you need to go to shareholders. When you go to shareholders, we have this new animal, which was not there in 2008, called the proxy advisor. In 2008, you could do anything and get away with it. Now the proxy advisor is going to tell institutional investors, this is happening to either the promoter or this pref is happening to a few sophisticated investors, vote against. So that obviously is another pressure that companies are facing. So we are seeing this huge change from 2008 to now, where the preference is largely for rights. So our team's very busy on 1,000 rights offerings going on right now, and there are many in the market which we're not on. So I know that the rights offering is a much more preferred way. Another very important thing which has happened is the change of the entire method of doing rights. In 2007-8, SEBI had a very heavy offer document linked review process. Over time, they've introduced fast track. They've even introduced reduced disclosure. All that has helped to make it faster. Of course, we could even make it faster. For example, a rights offering needs to be open 15 days. Nothing needs to be open 15 days now. So obviously, they could reduce it to 5 working days, but that's in the Companies Act, needs to go back to Delhi. SEBI alone can't change it. But we see the rights offering becoming more and more a routine way of doing it. There are some issues on disclosure. Some have more disclosure, some have less disclosure. And as a country, listed companies on a regular basis make relatively lesser disclosure as an average. I'm not talking about the best companies. Our best companies are comparable to anyone in the world. But I'm saying as the average, there are our average needs to move up for regular disclosure. Then, because what happens, if I can take a minute, Shrija, on that. If Singapore Airlines or Standard Chartered was to do rights offering, they simply take the document and they write, please refer to our last 3 annual reports. Please refer to a prior public disclosure A, B, C, D, E. From that date to this date, this is the additional update investors please note and please invest on this basis. Our past disclosures are not of the same standard that other jurisdictions have. It's a discussion we've been having with SEBI that we need to introduce disclosure. So I think, but the rights offering has become simpler procedurally in the last 10 years.
What about the IPOs then, Yash? Can IPOs really happen in this environment? Like what Mr. Shroff was alluding to, that they're questionable business models, at the worst. People also, the revenues are down to zero in some cases. Can really IPOs happen this time? And one doesn't really know when the capital markets really open up in a big way, because like no normal question remains to be the elusive one. So what happens to the IPO, the capital raise scenario then?
So part of me wants IPOs to happen now, right? Obviously, but I think that the real answer is that unlike a rights offering, an IPO needs to be marketed. There's also the issue of, see, how does an IPO happen? An IPO happens on the basis of 5, 6 successful quarters of growth, giving people an ability to see how the company is going to go up in the next few quarters. Now, what is going to happen? The March quarter is going to be okay because 80% of it was fine, 90% of it was fine, but the June quarter is going to be quite terrible for 90-95% of unlisted companies. And that will continue for some period this year. So it will be challenging. But some companies, leaving aside some companies, and I'll come to that. So for most companies who want to do an IPO, the quarters will be challenging, which means that their future will be a bit grey and difficult to predict. Therefore, projections on pricing will be very difficult. So unless there are shareholders and boards who are willing to leave more on the table, it will be very difficult to do an IPO. I don't think it's impossible. If someone can pull off a rights offering with lakhs and lakhs of shareholders, you can pull off an IPO with 80,000, 90,000 shareholders. It's not possible. Procedurally, it's not impossible. I think the challenge will lie in the business model, how much it has been tested, how it has sort of reacted, and what is its sort of near-term to medium-term ability to come out from this. Because please appreciate, if I as an investor have an option to invest in quality companies, which I know have gone through some difficulty but will come back strong, why should I invest money in a company which is unlisted and which has no history? So that's the sort of trade-off. So unless you have a relatively strong business model and you're leaving money on the table, it's not logical on companies approaching the market. That's part of the company. If you're very strong, for example, if your tech company has done very well in this period, then probably, obviously, it's going to be much easier. You will not have had bad quarters. You may have even very good quarters. And you may have a reverse problem of people thinking this is how it's going to be. And that may be, because even in China, if you see, post January, February period, and I know China is bad, but I'm sorry to bring it up on public for that. But if you see China, the usage of e-commerce sites in February, March, April was phenomenal. The depth, the number of people who are using e-commerce, age brackets which are using e-commerce. So I think there will be some new champions in our country, new listed players, and that will happen. But I think the challenge there, Shrija, is going to be profitability. How do our investors treat? They may still not be profitable. So is that acceptable? But many of them, as we know, when you order some food now, you are charged 50 rupees, which you were not charged 4 months back. So I think the new model of them sort of charging and making money is going to be what investors are going to be happy with in some ways. So I see that changing and that being sort of reflecting. So those kind of companies may approach in the third or fourth quarter, Shrija, is my prediction.
You said that they are challenges. When you're doing an IPO right now, perhaps you began with the entire resilience of the business model. You also said that the marketing could be difficult. Does that really mean on the side, perhaps it's a open opportunity for private equity investors to undertake some of these transactions just given they're sort of sitting on a huge dry powder? Will we see some of those transactions? Because if a company wants to do an IPO or do capital raise, I mean, just to raise capital, right?
Yes, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, because there's enough dry powder. Again, there depends on the valuations. I don't think the private equity player today is the same private equity player of 8 months back. So their 1 billion is still 1 billion.
Statement. Yeah.
Their 1 billion is still 1 billion. But would they invest it as blindly and as quickly? My answer is no. Not in India, not in Japan, not in UK, not in US. So I think they have now more appreciation of their 1 billion. They want to see better valuation. A football player who was worth 60 million last month is not worth 60 million today. So nothing wrong with the football player's skills. So I think similarly for a company, some of the e-commerce companies have performed well. So the valuations, they may think the valuations, they are now moved from unicorn to whatever corn, but I think there is going to be some challenges. Valuations will come down, the bubbles will sort of come down, and private equity will be the first option. I absolutely agree with you. Why go through the whole headache of an IPO when somebody is willing to give it to you? As long as you are realistic, whether it's a secondary or it's a primary, you're realistic with the price you're going to ask them for. That is going to be the main thing.
Interesting, you mentioned about the terminology unicorn and the very fact that private equity investor of today is perhaps not the same who was like 4 or 5 months back. Does it also mean that Yash, there could be this growing influence of direct listings that we are seeing, especially in the tech space that we've seen of late, really? And how does sort of that trend deepen as we go forward? Given that I have you on this webinar today, it would be sort of exciting to sort of get your views in that direction too. But it perhaps seems to be, more, a very in vogue kind of capital raising mechanism, direct listing.
Sure. Happy to do that. So our firm was working very closely with SEBI nearly 2 years back on the direct listing model. And recently even the finance minister, about a month back, in one of her 5 announcements, mentioned direct listing. The first thing is there is no circular yet. There is no mechanism to do direct listing. We know that a draft is in play and there is work happening. We know that it's in advanced status, but there is no such circular in place. Secondly, tax. I think issuance of that circular without a tax clarification, simply, if two people based in the US trade an Indian share, they'll have the same problem as a Vodafone. They are trading on the basis of Indian assets, they'll have to pay tax. So unless that tax treatment is clarified, so I think tax remains a big issue. There are other minor issues, which will, as things go along, they'll get sorted out. Procedurally, it'll be a challenge. But please try to appreciate, I think we'll have to find the right balance. The challenge for those companies to list in India will be the profitability issue, historic profitability. That is something which will not be a challenge in the US, which I think is going to be the chosen market, because in the US, for these kind of companies, they have historically not looked at profit. So I think that's where they'll have a benefit. But overall, there is a higher expectation of governance. I think, and I'm not an expert on US markets or how US investors will perceive this, but post this whole stress which has gone through, they may have higher sort of requirements for listings. And a US listing is not simple. I worked, our firm represented 2007 was one of the last direct listings. We've had some indirect listings and we've had some other complicated listings in the last 5-6 years. But I was a partner for our firm in the direct listing of an Indian company in the US. I had to do calls from NYSE, from NASDAQ, understanding Indian litigation. The governance requirements, the board responsibility is much higher. And there will be a huge amount of questions. I think the Indian regulator and the present geopolitical issues on should we not list in India will also be a question. So I think this is not simply done that you'll be able to list only outside India. I think there will be some pressure to list in India also. And then whose shares will be sold? Each of these companies have 15, 20, 30 shareholders. Will your shares be sold first or mine or his? I think that will also be an issue. And going continuously, fungibility and sort of other complicated issues will be there. So it will happen. Will it happen for everyone? I'm not betting on that. It will happen for maybe a few companies and it will be a new source of capital. I think as a country, why not? I think if there's somebody willing to put in money, I think as a country we will benefit from raising another source of capital. But we will have to find the right balance so that we don't see a flight of capital. Because in our firm work very closely with SEBI in 2005-06 to institute the QIP, Mr. Shroff was involved in the setting up of the whole QIP regulation because everybody took overnight GDRs in Luxembourg at that time. So we don't want a situation again where there's a flight, but at the same time we want a balance because eventually people who invest in the country, who put in billions of dollars, should have an exit mechanism. I don't think today our market is deep enough or even appreciative of. I would not invest in a company which is, I don't invest at all, but I would not invest in a company which is every quarter making a loss. It just makes no logical sense to me. But I'm saying that apart. So those are things I think which people will have to grapple with as they look to do listings of these companies in India and outside India.
Yeah, so I think yes, that was quite a sort of announcement from your end in terms of the challenges and perhaps having a more balanced approach when looking at direct listings. And you also sort of very rightly mentioned one not necessarily want flight of capital. I actually would want to sort of dabble and quickly get onto debt. I would also want to just pick up your minds on this entire phenomenon of delisting. Is that surely for real and it's here to stay? Maybe perhaps we'll come back to that. And I want to quickly get to Pranav now because I think there's so much to cover on the debt side also. We've heard quite a bit from Yash on the equity side. Pranav, I would sort of like to understand from you that the way Yash kind of mentioned the various tools for equity insurances and what the government is doing about it. What are the kind of scenarios that you are seeing, particularly on the debt raising side from India Inc.?
Hi, Shrija, and good morning, everyone. So I think obviously not as exciting as the equity markets that Yash was just describing some time back, but the debt markets certainly also have been very, very active, right? So it's like the old Dickensian quote of best of times and worst of times, because obviously we are seeing a lot of defaults or a lot of challenges around how to execute transactions, but equally we're seeing a lot of interesting innovation around, people trying to do new stuff, dusting off old instruments, relooking, at alternatives and other things to do. So it's actually been very interesting times. Actually, post lockdown, the first thing that happened is for share-backed financing, which again is a fair chunk of domestic portfolio. The stock prices, as we all know, had really corrected, and because of that, all of these financings are backed by share values, right? So there were a lot of defaults that had popped under all of these financings, and again, linked with that was the challenge around the Bombay High Court judgment, where a stay order was given against enforcement of pledges. So we spent a fair bit of time initially just advising lenders on their rights. Again, nobody wants to rush into a default, especially in that context, because the question is, will we have willing buyers even if we have, notionally the right to sell that collateral? So a lot of conversations with borrowers, lenders, trying to see, can we put in additional collateral? Can we avoid that default? Simple challenges. There were group companies, for instance, either offshore or onshore, where collateral could have been provided. But the RBI framework has very clear definitions of whose debt can be secured by which company, right? So even though you had a willing pledger or willing to give you additional collateral, but just because the shares, for instance, sat in an offshore company or a group company onshore, some of these required consents. And then in that lockdown scenario, to say get an authorized dealer, bank's consent, simple issues as again Yash was mentioning a bit earlier. Signatures, people who are used to seeing notarized, certified, stamped documents, getting them to move to a digital world and just getting those consents in place, right? I think simultaneously, people were rushing to draw down whatever unutilized lines they had, because again, cash was king, everybody really needs to sit on liquidity. And over there, again, fairly nuanced, tough conversations around some lenders unwilling to lend because they already foresaw problems with the credit. So, can we use stuff like historical breaches? Is there an implied waiver because you had actually not issued any, default notice or any reservation of rights letter? So can we really now, just to block further drawdowns, go out there and issue a draw stop notice, right? Issues around, some CPs which people were earlier okay to ignore, and they were okay to disburse, but suddenly people were now reading the contract very minutely, insisting on strict performance of the contract now. So again, from the borrower's perspective, it was a question of, I can use this cash, but is the end use tied up for specific purposes, and is that really what I want to do with the money right now? Because it was simply a cash flow management challenge for a lot of the borrowers, right? Like the moratorium did come in very quickly, and that has been a big help for most of the borrowers, is the feedback. But again, that moratorium only applies to domestic debt. It doesn't apply to offshore bond debt. It doesn't apply to offshore loans that have been raised. So those payments keep falling due during this entire 6-month moratorium period. The relief is only on domestic debt. And that's also created its own tugs and pulls in terms of, different creditors have different rights during this period. One of the key things that started again is there's a lot of debt that is obviously falling due for refinancing during this period. So the question is, do we just simply extend rollover or do we actually go out and refinance? And the question is, am I literally giving in new money to get my old debt back? Because if you are, and this is where you're determining the borrower is in financial difficulty, effectively the RBI framework recognizes that as evergreening and restructuring of assets. So again, fairly, careful conversations, discussions around can we do refinancings, in what context, are the banks comfortable that it will not be treated as a restructuring. So some of those challenges were there. And again, we're seeing, again, as Yash was mentioning, a lot of businesses have seen their cash flows fall off, right? So liquidity facilities have become very important. And if, say, you're a non-resident parent company, the current framework available to you means you really can't pump in short-term money, right? Because whether you come through the NCD FPI route or whether you come through a shareholder ECB construct, all of them have their own challenges around, minimum maturity, pricing, those sort of things. So some of those equity holders would have loved and readily would have infused would have infused short-term money, but because the money gets tied in, they're now looking for alternatives where we're trying to do either, collateral backed, where you provide collateral offshore to a foreign bank and then their onshore branches are lending, or we're trying to see new products like credit-linked notes, where you're again getting a bank with both offshore and onshore presence to lend to the Indian company. So a lot of new kind of products over there, and a lot of interesting activity that has been going on.
You mentioned a lot about the financing with options. So what regulatory changes on the anvil that you think that can sort of really enhance the debt fundraising capabilities of India? What do you think that you can sort of further expect from the regulators' perspective? And what would be your messaging to them?
Sure, absolutely. So I think let's just pick up what is already on the anvil, because RBI a few days back put out 2 new guidelines, and much awaited as well. The first one are on securitizations, which again have become a topic of a lot of interest, and we think a lot of promise, because as everybody knows, there's a lot of stress sitting with our BFSI sector, a lot of NBFCs and a lot of banks looking to offload portions of their portfolio or otherwise to raise liquidity for the balance sheet, right? And one of the best ways to do it is either a direct sale of the asset or to securitize the asset if you get the right set of investors. And again, securitization is also getting a lot of interest right now from foreign creditors, simply because under our regulatory framework, there are not a lot of mechanisms by which foreign creditors can access INR loan books. The fact that you can issue a PTC to a foreign portfolio investor, and that's a permitted investment for FPIs, that makes securitizations quite attractive to foreign investors. So the 2 or 3 key changes just to touch upon is that earlier under the old RBI guidelines, we couldn't have done single asset securitization, in the sense one single loan exposure by itself could not have been sold off by a bank or by an NBFC. You must have a homogeneous pool to sell. Now that condition has been taken away. You can now sell a single loan. So again, for instance, your blue chip assets, where you might get foreign investors or foreign lenders interested in that, or shareholders offshore who want to support that asset. That will open up a tap of liquidity for those banks and NBFCs. One of the other changes is that assets which, say, a lender had acquired previously from other lenders, those were not eligible for securitization. So that restriction has also now been removed. You can put those into a pool of securitized assets. Interestingly, especially given the challenges in the real estate side, they've given special benefits for retail mortgage securitizations. So, for instance, housing finance companies who are sitting on a fairly good pool of retail mortgages. So they've now actually come out with a structure where the minimum holding period before which you could sell down those loans, that has been reduced from the old guidelines. The amount which the originator needs to hold, which was the minimum retention requirement, that has also been, they've been given a concessional treatment for retail securitization. So I think that's one side of the market which should develop. They're also saying that if you go above 500 crores, then you have to do listed retail mortgage securities. So, investors such as mutual funds, pension funds, who can only do listed securities for their investment side, they will be now able to access this market, tap into it. So, overall, I think it's a very positive sign. Our securitization market should develop and should become even more robust. On the sell down side, two very interesting developments. There's a big push now towards risk participations. So, just to take very briefly, you don't actually have to now sell down the loan as a full sale. You can do a contract whereby the risk of default on that loan is taken over by your counterparty. Again, it's a great tool for stressed banks and NBFCs to de-risk themselves. And given stamp duty and those sort of challenges in India, actually it might be an attractive, simpler form for sharing your existing loan book with potential investors. And the other thing, which again, it's not really discussed much in detail in the guidelines, and you have to see how it plays out. They've said very interestingly that Indian lenders can now go ahead and acquire, exposures in offshore loans, ECBs. So again, that is a really big change because they're opening up a cross-border window. Indian banks can now hold foreign currency debt for Indian borrowers. So that's actually quite interesting in terms of potential workout situations where people may want to consolidate debt before they do a refinancing or restructuring solution. So I think very, very positive moves. I think very, very encouraging to see RBI coming out and supporting these kind of initiatives. And overall, I think in the next few weeks, once the guidelines get firmed up and announced, we certainly see a lot more appetite for transactions in these areas.
Shreya, we can't hear you. Pranav, whilst Shreya tries to... Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
I think Mr. Shroff has been very quiet for a while. We heard from Yash and Pranav. I want to sort of get you and Mr. Shroff that we heard from both the sides, the debt side and the equity side. If you were in the shoes of a corporate right now, how would you sort of maneuver think about fundraising right now, most from a debt and equity perspective? What do you think is the more plausible option right now and more attractive for people?
I think whilst that question is too broad, I think the answer will depend upon the type of the company in terms of its ownership pattern and also the sector that I am in. In a more promoter-oriented, promoter-led company where the promoters have a significant stake, I think I would veer towards the side of a rights issue because it allows me to maintain my stake. Just broadly, I mean, these are just broad things, not necessarily, because it will also further depend upon whether the promoter is liquid and whether the promoter is just another corporate or there's a family or a founder behind it. But roughly speaking, what I would veer is on the side of a rights issue. If I was a promoter-less company or the role of the promoter is more institutional holding, I might think of a QIP because it might be seen as faster, provided I can get over the hurdle of floor pricing, because that might be a sort of a constraint. And this is one area where I think the the regulators and policymakers really need to act fast. There are at least 6 varieties of pricing in the overall regulatory system: a 2-week price, a 6-week price, this price, that price, reverse book building, and others. So I think the policy environment needs to sit down once and for all and say, okay, fair price is or a floor price is a good concept, but can we make up our mind now once and for all what is the formula that, because you can't have so many different varieties and different regulations. So if we can arrive at a good thought, good sort of model for fair floor pricing, that might be an answer for allowing some of this capital raising to move faster. But that's on the policy environment side. To come back to your question on what would I do if I were a corporate, I think it really depends on, as I said, firstly on the ownership construct, and secondly on the sector, because that might determine what kind of investors I would expect. So if I'm in a kind of a new economy, I would get a little bit more in terms of specialist tech or institutional investors globally. So that might be one approach that I would take. And in the meanwhile, I think just to sort of continue on the debt theme, number of instruments which Pranav spoke about, I would explore all of them. There is still that elusive convertible that we've been trying to find for the last decade. I would try to find that one.
Yeah, so
and I'll work with the policy makers to now once and for all kind of allow it, because they've just been kicking the can down the road for so many years. I think they should be bold now and allow this. Yeah, she was saying something.
Yeah, so to add what I was saying, I think the gap in the entire sort of framework of instruments available to Indian corporates, this elusive instruments which Sir mentioned, is a convertible instrument which has a convertible option of 3 to 5 years, and which is rupee denominated. I think that's the one key instrument which is missing for Indian corporates. I am sure I have some. I can understand some of the regulatory concerns. Completely appreciate them, but at the same time, to not allow at this price, if people are willing to take a risk on an Indian company, then why not? And if it's rupee denominated, there's a degree. What's the big difference between an FCCB and a similar rupee convert if it existed? With an FCCB at today's dollar price, the dollar would go to 100. So not only do you have to pay an 8-10% return, but you also have to adjust for the dollar movement to the rupee. So you could be paying 30% return. Similarly, but if you had a rupee instrument, at least you could address the dollar issue, and you could also give enough upside to the investor and no downside. That's a requirement of the investor. We may question how investors think like that, but then that investors don't know, they have at their end their own investors whose pools of money they're investing. So I think somewhere this has been an instrument which has not been there in Indian capital markets for many years, and I think this is probably a time with the right bells and whistles we can work with the regulator to come up with an instrument. I think it will really help the markets, and it will really help Indian investors get caught, because see, people are going to be stuck in the company for 3 years, they're not going to leave. So you're going to get good quality investors putting in rupees and helping Indian companies and helping them grow. I think that's something which one must consider.
I think my message to the policymakers would be to be bold now, because if you're not going to be bold in this time, then when are you going to be bold in terms of making some of these changes? And even on the banking side, it's all very well to say that the banks will lend to needy corporates and all of that, but actually when you come down to the trenches, it's quite brutal. Either the banks won't lend, or they'll push you to either stress funds or other types of lenders, and who are actually quite ruthless in terms of the kind of expectation they have, either in terms of returns or in terms of the security and the support that they're requiring. A lot of it is not practical at all. So there needs to be some kind of softening of the overall framework to actually allow credit to flow. There are a lot of letters of sanction that are being issued, but 200 conditions attached, and that's not disbursement.
Strong piece of messaging coming from you to the policymaker that if you don't sort of take bold decisions now, when will you take it? This is perhaps the right time to do it. I want to sort of, dwell a little more upon this delisting phenomenon. Is this for real? Are we going to see more of that in the near future? Perhaps the conditions seem to be conducive now. This is what you mentioned, Mr. Shroff, that the fundamentals of business models also being questioned. Is delisting for real? Yes, perhaps you can sort of throw some light on that one, and we can take it.
Yeah, Rush has written a recent article as well. So Yash, why don't you share your thoughts?
Thank you. So I think delisting again has been in the news. Many companies have announced delisting. So let's understand delisting in India can only be successful if 90% of your shareholders participate. It can only be successful if you do a reverse book building, which simply means that if you have a large chunk, the promoter is offering 100, you go and say 150, the price has to move to 150 because you have a large chunk. So it's a bit of a blackmail, if I may call it. And the third is there are no squeeze out provisions. For example, in the UK, the threshold is not 90, it's 80. The moment you cross 80, you can squeeze out. Then what happens if you go from, say, 50% today, you go up to 80. Then the law says quickly come back to 75 because you can't stay at 80. So in India, procedurally, delisting is very challenging. And for a variety of reasons we've discussed with the regulator, the Indian regulator does not like delisting. It is a very bad word. But I think somewhere one must appreciate if the price is so low, if someone's willing to pay a good price, willing buyer, willing seller, I think we should facilitate that mechanism. So I suspect in a lot of cases, just the announcement of the delisting is pushing the prices up. I think that may also be the intent of some promoters, who are seeing what is happening today. Let's appreciate. The moment the prices crash, the promoter has taken a pledge, he or she has put their shares out, and the shares are being sold. And sometimes the value of that share is lower than the fair value of the company. So I think that's just unfair. So I think somewhere such an announcement that I will get more money and I am backing the company is a strong vote of confidence. I don't think all delisting will go through because of procedural challenges and also because the price will move up and people don't have unlimited sources of money. But I do think that we are seeing more brave promoters who are willing to back the company and are confident that if they have to do the delisting, then they take the company private, do whatever taking a company public is not easy. Keeping it public is not easy. That is all official. So when you take it private, you have more flexibility, and if you are because you're taking it public, one advantage is that it reflects the correct price. If the correct price is not reflected, then you go backwards and then you do whatever you need to.
I would sort of also want to understand, more about the tech phenomenon here, because I think we have not really touched upon that. That's a very significant piece of business that is growing up. While for traditional businesses, one can understand the traditional modes of capital raising, equity, or debt. But when you have these new age tech businesses and you have the unwinding of the likes of a SoftBank or Tiger Group, what means of fundraising is available to these guys now? Will they be more open to looking at one of these conventional options? Can one say that? Because the timing is equally challenging for them also.
I think the first question is the business model. I think will the business model survive this period? I think forget their shareholding, forget the quantum of money they put in, but can their business model today survive? I think that's the first question. Assuming you can cross that question, then I think are you able to make profit? You may have a good business model, but are you able to make profit and how quickly can you make profit? So I think then what we've done is with the announcement of things like direct listing, we've sort of facilitated and given a new option. Okay, Indian investors don't want to invest in such companies because of good reason. Companies are making money, I don't want to invest. But there's another sophisticated investor in the US. There could be some endowment funds, there could be university funds who've seen an Alibaba, Amazon go from negative to worth trillions of dollars. They are willing to take that risk. So maybe there are some Indian companies who are today not being profitable. There could be global investors whose assessment of those companies is that they are willing to take that call. So I think the first question will have to boil down to, can you survive? Because what is happening? The existing shareholders will at some point of time stop putting in more money. The requirement is more money. So either existing put in more money or you go to new. If new don't come directly, then you go to an IPO. If IPO also you can't get somebody to put in money, then you have to figure out what the challenge is and then whether you have to sell off or break up the business or relook at the model. As tough as it may sound, as much as the labor implications, many of these tech companies employ a lot of Indians, and really help. I think there are I think somewhere our regulators need to look at the sort of number of people who get direct and indirect employment on account of some of these tech companies. Whilst these companies may be not employing as much as an Infosys or TCS or Wipro, but at the same time they generate a lot of employment for uneducated and people who don't have access to the same that. So I think there are benefits. So I think we as a country should give them a platform, and we'll see how many can list abroad. And I'm sure they'll all want to list in India. I think they eventually, if your asset is Indian, today if you look at the biggest companies in China and others, they eventually listed in Hong Kong also or Shanghai. So,
Understanding from you that a lot of business models questionably come under scanner, the path to profitability will have to be clearer, much clearer than it was the equation before. Mr. Shroff, in terms of your concluding remarks, and then we sort of get into the Q&A, from the panel, and what I was understanding that, what about this hostile takeover phenomenon? I mean, do we sort of also see that? I know we're getting into the M&A route now, but that's also a very important conversation here in terms of, fundraising, both the debt and equity side. Will that be a more open phenomenon right now, hostile takeover? Will we see more of that now?
That's a great question, Shrija, and I think that should be the subject matter of another episode of one of the Saturday mornings. But the kind of history of hostile takeovers goes back now almost 3 decades, right from the Swaraj Poll time, and then several sort of episodes after that. And it's always been very difficult to make a hostile takeover of an Indian company. There are 2-3 main hurdles to it. I think the first hurdle is the fact that a lot of our valuable corporates have a big promoter sitting there. It's very difficult to make a hostile acquisition where the ownership pattern is not a distributed retail pattern, but you have a huge promoter sitting there. It's almost impossible to take over. To make a hostile bid on that company. So that is point number 1. The point number 2 is that just the overall business culture, including the noisy media, regulators, all of that. If one of our kind of star companies got a hostile bid from somebody who is not liked, I think overall the battle will get so exhausting. Both in the media as well as from a PR point of view, that eventually the acquirer will put his tail between the legs and leave. They will not work with it. And people know that, and there have been several kind of examples of that. So, broadly speaking, hostile takeovers is a challenge. Now, that being said, ironically, our takeover code does not have a poison pill. Like, say, for example, in the US, where the shareholders could pass a resolution and build a poison pill. And I think there is an open question out there whether this is the right time now for Indian corporates, particularly the newer age companies which have a very small promoter holding, to think about is this the time now for a poison pill? And I think this conversation has just started. I don't know where it eventually leads. So. This is as far as equity, making a hostile offer from the equity route. But if you look back at the last 2 or 3 years, hostile acquisitions have happened through the IBC. They have not happened through the equity route or the public market route. The moment a good business gets into a sort of a debt problem and lands up at the IBC door, then it's open season, and the interesting thing is that because of Section 29A, the promoter, who is the incumbent, cannot play. I mean, whether it's SR Steel, or there's so many, these are all examples in a very broad context, these are examples of hostile acquisitions. So going forward, what should be the route? I think the thought for points to ponder for the policy makers is it time for a poison pill? My personal view is that yes, it is, with some kind of safeguards attached to it. I think it is also time for relooking, the point I made earlier, relooking at 29A for kind of clean promoters. I'm not one who's sort of advocating where there has been fraud and others that you should relax that, but because if you don't allow the incumbent to play, is it fair at all? I mean, there are a lot of unintended consequences at the severity of 2019. And I think the third broader question is whether we need to relook at the larger landscape of foreign hostile acquisitions. So I think there is this press note fee business, so it seems to be more directed at one country rather than more broadly as well. So are we going to have our crown jewels vulnerable to hostile acquisition, and how have other countries dealt with it? The US has something called CPS, where there is a kind of a merit review of the acquirer is, and it goes through that process. So maybe we need to think about something like that, where you don't want your crown jewels falling into the wrong hand. But except for that, I think it should be open season with the right of a poison pill. So I would go to a more US style model where hostile takeover is good because it keeps the management accountable. You need to protect your crown jewels and give the shareholders the right to a poison pill. So if they want to sort of wear a shield of armor, they should. What we now have is total confusion. So we are neither capitalist nor socialist. We actually don't know what we are.
Very meaningful set of recommendations going from the policymakers, from you and Mr. Shroff. I think every Saturday we have this phenomenon of you sort of ending with one trivia in your mind, really. So what is that? We started with Ajit Kumar joke for the first one. I think we're in the third phase right now. So you have to give me what's going on in your mind today.
What's going on in my mind today is I'm looking forward to sort of eating a plate of bhelpuri at my favorite restaurant, which I have been deprived with for the last 3 months. So this isolation I know is a bit soul-crushing, but at the same time it has allowed us to have these kind of interactions.
Okay.
But yes,
my first question to you is, the first thing that comes to your mind when I say the following: profiteering from a pandemic.
Yes, it's not normal that you have to do that.
On most Saturdays, I spend most Saturdays thinking about my Sunday morning run. So mentally, I'm already thinking about my 15 kilometers run and hoping it'll rain tomorrow so I can run in the rain.
So, Sija, you may not know, but Yash is a marathon runner and he's quite prolific. For him, his first priority in life is running. So, you should ask him a running question.
Yeah. So, Pranav, come to you to the investors in this scenario.
Apologies, Shrija, I couldn't hear you very well. Do you mind just repeating that question? Good to have you back, Shrija. Sorry, I couldn't catch your question. Do you mind just repeating that?
Can you hear me now, Pranav?
Yes, now I can.
Now finally we can.
Okay. I'm saying that how opportunistic should investors get in the pandemic?
Well, I think people are being opportunistic, right? So there are special situations and stressed asset investors who are actually looking at some great opportunities right now. In fact, we are working on some transactions as well. So, if you have a loan-to-own strategy, and again, as Mr. Shroff was saying a bit earlier, debt today is a very powerful tool, and the amount of leverage that sits in corporate India, Indian promoters are discovering that there's a ugly side and a downside to leverage as well. So people are there are very sophisticated investors who are now very carefully looking at Indian businesses and seeing where can I consolidate debt and then use that as a lever for either coming in and taking over the whole business or doing a settlement and getting an equity upside. So we're seeing some very genuinely, I think it's a complete evolution of the Indian structured credit and banking landscape. Genuinely very interesting opportunities being explored.
Okay. We have some specific questions from the audience. I think we should take a couple of them. There's one question from Atul Lakhotia, and he's asked that in case of CCDs for unlisted company, whether the conversion price in ration is to be decided upfront at the time of the issue. And there's one question for you, Yash. How do you see the buyback landscape panning out in India in the light of reducing share prices during COVID times? Do you think this is an opportunity for the promoters and companies to buy back shares when the valuations are considerably low?
CCD question maybe I can think about, but I think on the buyback question, cash is king and queen and everything else. So it would take brave companies to want to return cash, because eventually a buyback is cash that you return back to your shareholders. So there's a very good reason for anyone just now not to keep the cash they have with them. If they feel their model is doing fine and they don't need any cash and they want to return cash to their promoters and other shareholders, then obviously that's an option. But we have seen buybacks come down a lot. And I think because promoters have to, tax treatment for promoters has changed. So I think generally buybacks have come down, and I think at this point of time, everyone should keep their cash.
Okay. There's another question perhaps, Mr. Shroff, you could take a stab at that, and I think it's for regulators. How are regulators treating valuations given the fact that there has been unprecedented change in business scenario? In the post-COVID era, chances are therein which bankruptcies would rise, leading to pressures in banking sector. How would the fundraising methodology and environment change? It's basically how regulators, yeah.
I think there are multiple questions in that. The first, I think, was the valuation one.
Yeah.
And I kind of commented on that in my other remarks. Is that there is just too much confusion in terms of the number of formulas that are floating around, in terms of what the policy system or the regulatory system considers as fair price. Whether it's 2 weeks, 6 weeks, something else, fair value. So I think all the regulators need to sit down on a table together and say, okay, our concept of fair value in general is this. In these special circumstances where something like 6 months doesn't make any sense anymore, even 3 months doesn't make any sense anymore. This is the limited exception that we are making for this unprecedented situation. And that's it. Let there be clarity, because otherwise it's like navigating a whole maze from which you don't know how to sort of get out of it. So this is, I think there is a scope for simplification of a philosophy of fair values. And I think this is part of the problem. I think the problem which Yash mentioned about preferential allotments, what you run into, or a QIP, you run into all those low pricing problems. Or if you're bringing in a private equity investor, you run into that problem as well. So why are we creating hurdles to putting in capital? The capital providers are sitting with their checkbook. The borrowers are sitting with give me the money kind of mentality. Why have we created so much friction in the process of moving up? And it is not there in any other country in the world. I think we really need to simplify this, because this is, I think, at the heart of ease of doing business from a financial markets perspective. So that's one question. Can you repeat the second part of the question?
So the question, the second part is that in the post-COVID era, chances are there in which bankruptcies would rise, leading to pressures in the banking sector. How would the fundraising methodology and environment change? I think you have sort of touched upon that quite a bit in your comments.
Yeah, I think we are just hiding the problem. So there was actually an interesting quote in an article in the Financial Times 2-3 days ago. And they compared this bankruptcy problem to, it's like there are a lot of dead bodies which are hiding into the carpet.
Yeah, I read that. Yeah.
And you read that. So you can't kind of see it, but someday you'll have to deal with it. So that.
Yeah, and just to add to that, right, I think one of the biggest challenges is post DHFL and post Altico Capital. People are acutely aware of bankruptcy risk with especially the NBFC sector. So, what we are going to see a lot of is portfolio sales. There are already a lot of discussions in the market where people are looking for portfolio sales. You will see a lot of risk participation, securitizations. These are the products we were talking about. And one product where a bit of regulatory support and clarity is required are covered bonds, where covered bonds are essentially, bonds that are issued by, say, a financial institution like a bank or NBFC, but they are ring fenced and bankruptcy remote. So, you do secured lending to a bank or NBFC against an identified pool of loan book of that originator, of that lending and of that borrowing entity. And you are ring fenced in an insolvency. So tomorrow, even if, for instance, the issuer was to go into insolvency, the holders of that covered bond would be fully protected because they have access to that segregated capital. Now, that's a very popular instrument for financing the BFSI sector in many jurisdictions globally. It's not taken off in India. There have only been one or two highly complex structured variations of that. And that's something which certainly I think the regulator should think and popularize, because especially in this market where the liquidity need is so dire, it would be a great product. The investors are really looking for it. And we've even had multilateral institutions pushing at the MOF and RBI level to introduce that. So I think that's a product whose time has come.
There's one question that while on buyback, the tax implication of 20% on the company and 10% on capital gains is still more effective with the current tax rates payable to promoters and high net investors where tax is much higher. I think this question is, I really can't understand this question. It's a confusing question by Jimmy Spencer. I think there's one more question, which is a more clearer question from Jeevan. We'll take that. We have seen banks' cost of funds coming down significantly due to RBI TLTROs. However, NBFC's cost of funds are quite unchanged. How can NBFCs reduce their cost of funds, especially since a lot of lending takes place through NBFCs? Pranav, you want to take that up?
Sure, happy to take that. I think that's like I don't know, I'm not that great at maths, but $1 billion or $1 trillion question, because that is the essence of the world we're living in, right? So the government keeps announcing this TLTRO where, banks are supposed to take money and then on-lend it down to NBFCs. But again, as Mr. Shroff touched upon right at the beginning, banks are off risk, right? So net today, credit is only flowing to the strong corporates where banks are comfortable that, there's either a strong credit risk perception over there, or, the market will pick up that debt tomorrow if I have to sell it off, right? Other than that, we are not seeing that transmission down to the NBFC sector. And frankly, it's a genuine issue. It's a market issue that we are facing. And the solutions lie in what really we've been touching upon. So you need to give confidence to the investors that either there is some sort of a bailout for those stressed assets, or we discuss a bad bank. A bad bank also has been discussed. Or again, you frankly need to make sure that there is enough liquidity being created by portfolio sales, securitizations, covered bonds, that people are confident that if I lend to an NBFC, my money will come back. It's simply a confidence and a risk issue where investors today are highly wary about lending to NBFCs.
I think there are a lot of interesting revelations made in this conversation today, sort of traversing from debt and equity to buybacks to rights issue to QIPs, from hostile takeover. I think the questions will keep pouring in. There's so much to draw from this meaningful panel. I also want to dwell a little further on confidence capital per se and how that term becomes so fashionable in the time access capital started. But I think we sort of dwell more on that in a further sort of webinars. And this has really become a phenomenon now. Saturday appointment viewing 11 a.m. on these thought leadership conversations. Till that time, we see you next. Goodbye and good luck, and please stay safe. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, pleasure.